Today, Senator Whitehouse and I are announcing the formation of a bicameral task force on climate change. We plan to focus on three key goals. We'll try to raise awareness for our colleagues and the public about the dangers from climate change. We'll provide a forum for developing effective policies to combat this climate change, and we'll work to enact measures to reduce carbon pollution, spur new technologies, and enhance efforts to adapt to the harm that climate change is already happening and will be unable to avoid. We'll be inviting members of both parties, both in the House and the Senate, to join us. Membership in the task force is open to all members of Congress, regardless of their political party, who recognize the importance of climate change and the need for effective policies. We will be working closely with other leaders in Congress, such as Senator Boxer and Congressman, maybe soon to be Senator Ed Markey in the House. While members of Congress often organize task force and working groups and coalitions, it's unusual for members to create a bicameral task force, and we're taking this step because the time for action is now. Every day we wait, every time we allow an opportunity to reduce our carbon pollution pass us by, it becomes less likely that we will be able to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, the impacts of climate change are already beginning. The seas are rising faster than expected. The Arctic is melting faster, and the weather is growing more extreme. The bad weather we had last year was almost biblical in its intensity. Severe droughts, raging wildfires, floods, superstorms, and that's mild compared to what we can expect in the future. At the same time, our window to act is rapidly closing. We cannot afford to wait to take action. Once we release carbon into the atmosphere, it stays there for hundreds of years. There's only so much carbon that the atmosphere can hold before the impacts become irreversible. And we're fast approaching that point of no return. This threat is not waiting until we are ready to act on it. When the next generation looks back on this era, they won't be talking about what we did about the deficit or the fiscal cliff. It will be whether we rose to the historic challenge from global warming and climate change. Members of both parties in both chambers of Congress have a moral obligation to act. President Obama was absolutely right when he said this week, if we fail to act, we will, quote, have betrayed our children and future generations, unquote. Earlier this month, the draft National Climate Assessment reminded us that we must act now. This compilation of the very best science on what is already happening in the United States found more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, extreme storms like Superstorm Sandy, rising sea levels, and far worse to come. During the last 4 years, the Obama administration has taken important steps in the right direction. Significant investments in solar and wind energy doubled the production of clean, renewable energy. The new tailpipe standards for automobiles will double fuel economy and produce major reductions in carbon pollution from passenger vehicles. The Environmental Protection Agency has proposed new standards for power plants. But during the last 2 years, the House of Representatives has tried to thwart the president at every step. The Republican-led House of Representatives voted 53 times to block action on climate change. House Republicans even voted to deny that climate change is occurring. And when Congressman Rush and I wrote to the leadership of the Energy and Commerce Committee over 20 times requesting a hearing on the important developments related to climate change, we never received even a single response to our letters. That's a dismal record of inaction. To help spur action, we're forming a bicameral climate change task force. Senator Whitehouse will work together to educate our colleagues and all Americans about the magnitude of the problem and the urgency of the threat we're confronting. President Obama understands how important decisive presidential leadership on climate change is. We saw that earlier this week in his inaugural address. And today we are writing to the president to urge him to take the next step and develop a comprehensive climate change plan using his broad administrative authorities. 3 years ago, the president pledged in Copenhagen that the United States will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. Much to our dismay, Congress has not acted since then to meet this pledge. Now it's time for the president to act administratively to make sure the United States meets this goal and is on the path for further reductions going forward. We believe the plan should also explain the specific steps federal agencies will take to accelerate investments in innovative clean energy technologies and protect the many vulnerable regions of the nation from the worst effects of climate change. We'll do our part to assist in this effort. In the coming weeks, the task force intends to open a dialogue with all sectors of our economy about constructive steps the administration can take to address climate change. We'll share those ideas with the administration as it crafts its plan. Well, I'm really looking forward to working with Senator Whitehouse on this effort and want to turn this over to him for his remarks. But before I do, I just want to point out that throughout the last Congress, any efforts to address climate change were under constant assault here in the nation's capital. And throughout that dark time, Senator Whitehouse was undaunted. He was a voice of moral clarity on climate change when too few were standing up for our children and future generations. He deserves tremendous credit for what he has done, and it gives us expectations of what both of us and all of our colleagues need to accomplish in the future. Senator.
Thank you. It is a distinct pleasure for me to join Ranking Member Waxman to announce the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change. Throughout his distinguished 38 years in Congress, Congressman Waxman has led the fight to protect public health and the environment and defeated countless attacks on our environmental laws. Through his work, families have cleaner air to breathe and cleaner water to drink. And he has fought tirelessly to ensure that our children and grandchildren inherit a healthy planet. Congressman Waxman was one of the primary architects of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. In 1992, he introduced the first bill in Congress to stabilize the climate. His cap-and-trade legislation, the American Clean Energy and Security Act, commonly known as Waxman-Markey, passed the House of Representatives under his leadership in 2009. Congressman Waxman's fingerprints are on some of the country's most impressive environmental and public health milestones. In the spirit of my senior colleague, I have become an active voice on climate change, going to the Senate floor every week, because I've listened to the scientists, to the defense and intelligence communities, and to the American people. Human activity, carbon pollution, is making the world warmer, and the emission of greenhouse gases is putting us at increasing risk. For 8,000 centuries, mankind has inhabited a planet with atmospheric carbon between 170 and 300 parts per million. To put that in perspective, agriculture has been around for 100 centuries. Homo sapiens have been around for about 2,000 centuries. And we are now way outside that 8,000 century carbon range, hitting for the first time 400 parts per million in April of 2012. The changes we are making to our planet are truly unprecedented in the history of our species. An AP poll in December found that 83% of Democrats, 77% of independents, and 70% of Republicans accept the reality of climate change and believe it will be a serious problem for the United States. A recent Yale University and George Mason University poll found that 77% of Americans say climate change should be a priority for President Obama and for us in this Congress. The urgency of Americans' call to action is especially evident when you look to the oceans, as I often do, representing the ocean state. The oceans are absorbing about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide per hour. This has caused a nearly 30% increase in ocean acidity. That rate of increase in ocean acidity is faster than any time in the past 50 million years. We're on the path to causing chemical changes in the oceans that we haven't seen in the last 300 million years. We're beyond species history now and into geologic time. These changes are all too evident to Rhode Islanders. Just outside Narragansett Bay, the crew of the Brenton Reef lightship took nearly 22,000 ocean temperature measurements between 1878 and 1942. Alarmingly, the modern temperature record from points around Narragansett Bay shows that since the 1960s, the annual temperature in Narragansett Bay has increased about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Long-term data from the tide gauges in Newport, Rhode Island show an increase in average sea level of nearly 10 inches since 1930. And the rate of that sea level rise is increasing too. In southern Rhode Island, local erosion rates doubled from 1990 to 2006. And some of our freshwater wetlands near the coast are already transitioning to salt marsh. Sea level rise and the increase in storm surges that will accompany it threaten critical infrastructure like roads, power plants, and wastewater treatment plants. These are not easy concerns for communities with limited resources and with lives and livelihoods being put at risk. Nature could not be giving us clearer warning signs, and yet we are sleepwalking through history here in Washington. It's time to wake up, to awaken to our duties, and awaken to our responsibilities. And I could have no better colleague to rouse this sleeping Congress to its duty than Henry Waxman.